Yeah, let's do it.
Um, I'm recently learning the use of the word because
Yeah,
I've got friends who are like, so use it so I can use it too, like word.
right, right. Word, word. I like that. Look at you. That's
Word.
what's up. That's what's up.
That's
Yeah.
what's up. Okay, so thinking about this, I dropped you dropped out for a second, so I'll ask you to rephrase a few things. But you did tell me that there is a notion for your core parameters, right? The big bets you're placing on co-creation of culture, or in sequence empowerment. That's
Hmm.
almost foundational, and you'll have to place a bet on empowerment because most companies are command and control. So there are islands of empowerment, but overall, it's still command and control, right? You have to place a bet on co-creation and what that means. So therefore, there's some insight needed on what does it mean to have co-create a culture.
Hmm.
And there's probably a bet on interest and how interest is extremely important for people following their passions. And
Right.
what does that mean? You mentioned cultural carriers, but I blanked out on the rest of it, saying when you're in E&Y, you would participate and you would get things together, but also feedback. Go over that part again.
Yeah. So, the one thing when I was at EY, I was able to increase participation within our Black professional network by 30%.
Hmm.
And the reason why and how I was able to do that was because I asked for feedback specifically from groups that were missing, which were like the staff and senior Black professionals, on
Hmm.
what they would want
Hmm.
out of the BPM, what kind of things that they were looking for. And they were really looking for more access to management
Hmm.
and mentorship. So then I created programming that stemmed exactly from that feedback. So
Hmm.
that's the other key that I think is missing in companies. It's like you want to know what your employees want, ask them versus assuming and just creating things that they won't attend.
Hmm. Okay. So that's almost a bet by itself, which is it almost talks to co-creation. So as you're going further into it, may also happen that you realize you have some natural thinking in certain areas it's very finished, and other areas of thinking are blank because it's intuitive to you. You have a
Mhm.
sense of it, but not the language, and maybe that's what happens next. So if you think about co-creation, um, kind of the general principle of co-creation is ask before you create,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
um, and that is still the ownership still lies with HR. Hey, and we've seen this working in our labs in Bangalore. So essentially, HR would create a policy, but then they would constitute a committee
Mm.
filled with employees
Mhm.
for all the domains that employees were invested in. Food, transportation, events,
Mm.
and the committee would be given equal amount of power, but veto rights remained with HR.
Mm.
So they had final call, but there was a lot of interaction. So that's one thing, right? And then making and organizing this is one approach, right? So that's one instrument almost of. So when you think about a bet, if you ask before you create, how would you embody it? The
Mm.
experiment would be, hey, why don't we allow simpler formation of committees with policies and blah, 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 and templatize the whole thing. That could
Mhm.
be it, right? So, um, for example, co-creation experiments could include one, making it easier to ask,
Yeah.
right? That's one.
Mm.
Two, making it easier to work together,
Mhm.
right? Three, making it easier to share success, whatever that might mean,
Mm. I like these.
right?
Yeah.
And then the question is, how do you embody this? How do you make it easier to ask? But now you can think, saying, oh, we pretty low tech right now, just mails back and forth. But what if you gave some structure?
Mm.
um, Working together, typically like I said, in labs forms committees. There's a pattern to these things. We exchange over 500 emails, they all go in a certain way. What if you templatize all that so you could get started quickly, right?
Right.
Share success means usually these things work like credit rolls, right? When the whole thing is put together, you want them on stage, and it worked only because these fellows helped out, blah blah blah. And for making that even norms, saying when you do committee based work, you've got to make sure there's a credit slide comes up in the first slide or second slide. Make sure the photograph is taken and things like that. So that could be co-creation. bets in the direction of co-creation of culture. What are you thinking of so far? How does that sound?
Yeah, no, I like that. I feel like I even like I always talk about the narratives and the pain points from my
Mm,
particular, because I feel like a lot of it comes out of the founder's story and journey and all that.
mm,
And I remember at EY we had one volunteer event per year, like for our office, and it was like a
mm,
nationwide thing
mm,
where everyone took that day off. But I remember I specifically wanted to volunteer more than once a year, so I would go by myself. And I always
mm,
wanted to bring my team along with that, but it was like kind of hard to get that buy-in because I felt like we should have been working all the time and that there wasn't really a space
mm,
to create that. So what did we do? We just had the happy hour every Friday or every other Friday, again
mm,
and again and again and again. Um, so yeah, I feel like asking, I think is
mm,
like really, I think a good one, and then figuring out how that ask can lead people to work together to make it happen.
mm. So that also I'm also feeling that this is leading to the narrative of empowerment, which is um, empowerment essentially means you have a certain degree of power as an institution that employs somebody else, and you choose to give some of that power away.
Right.
You've aggregated it. It usually gets aggregated to the tops, from employees less to managers more, and so on. You choose to give it away with some accountability.
Right.
Say, hey, so we are going to give you power, but
Mm.
it's not unbridled power. We're going to give it, so no authority without responsibility. And for example, saying that instead of just doing it, we understand most people want. So building on the first one, they're asking most people want to contribute more than once a year. And we understand this is our value system says work, 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 work. Okay, and then take a day off. We understand the new generation has a value is different from ours. We will allow it, but it's just not a freebie. We need you to do something in turn. We need to
Yeah.
tell us why this is ABC. So what's your, one way of thinking about empowerment is, how do you frame it? What's your narrative? And what's the bet for empowerment?
My bet is if you make it easier for
Mm,
these people who are already taking on an additional job
mm,
within
mm,
what their full-time role is,
mm,
that the outcome of what they're doing will be better in terms of they'll get more participation, they'll
mm,
get more buy-in from across the organization, not just within their group because those are the people they know.
mm,
But then they'll also be able to understand what else people want because they already have raised their hand and said, we want to do this for our company.
mm,
But the thing that they're missing, they're not also then going to go out and poll 100 people and then ask every person after the event how it was and rate it and score
mm,
it and invite people from their group, other groups, right? So
mm,
if you empower them, they've already raised their hand and identified themselves. But
mm,
you make that easier, then I
mm.
think you get a better result, better outcome, and then you can continue to improve on it.
Better results and outcome in what sense?
In the sense of how the experience resonated with the attendees, right? If
Mm,
that was
mm,
mentorship, if it was volunteerism, if it was fitness,
mm,
but then also how you are able to facilitate community or what community looks like in your org instead of community. And I think in a way, community has always been based around team. It's become a lot more based around team than it has been about as companies get bigger than the organization within itself. But
mm,
how can you create more community amongst teams and break down those
mm,
silos? And I think that's something that can be a better result through
mm.
this.
So this probably we'll go into it a little bit more, because you can see even as you read it, there are elements that are there in your head, but they are not made into language yet, right? If you make it easy for people, and you said I think I misunderstood, to raise their hand.
Yeah, like volunteer. Like they
Yeah,
say, hey, like I love to,
yeah,
do this type of stuff. They
yeah.
volunteer to create community.
So exactly. So I feel, so then it depends on how bold you want to be in empowerment. Is it facilitative or is it really empowerment? In the sense that one thing is to reduce friction, saying it's just we'll have ways, So here's framing. if you simply say make it easier, they'll put a technology system that lets you raise your hand and saying, here, you raise your hand digitally or upvote or downvote. That's not power though.
Yep.
Empowerment would really mean that if there is, you give a certain degree of freedom to the person, the example being 20% point, 20% projects in Google, right? The value is not that the company gets something out of it directly in terms of tangible benefit. Long term it does. The direct value is that the employee gets to tell to the manager, this 1 day a week is my time. And nobody can take this away from me. So you can see it builds agency, because they can say, I will work my ass off for you 4 days a week, but the 1 day that we agree on is my time, and the company says so. And that's almost always informed by policy. Yeah. So there's almost a question of what policy do you foresee, because almost like a plug-in module, right? That will allow empowerment in the area of culture without essentially breaking the system down, but do these other things you spoke about, which means the eventual goal, like I said, is to get cohesion across the company. And we said a couple of things, isn't it? Collaboration and cohesion across the company. What could you do? And maybe it's only worth thinking about right now, that what could you suggest in terms of empowerment that would allow for cohesion? These things might. So for example, if you could raise your hand easier, it might, but then these people already are self-selected.
Yeah.
They already are brave and saying, hey, I really want to do this. Empowerment would be the guy in the back of the room who didn't want to do it, now feels inspired, saying, this was the best thing I ever did. I wasn't planning to. And his story going from, no to yes, inspires other people saying, I want to do this as well. That leads to collaboration. And then these groups decide to do something significant in terms of a crisis or an event and saying, well, we helped out. The next time, hurricane so-and-so hit.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
Like thinking about how, like the people who also maybe just haven't felt heard or didn't think that anyone from their team will want to do it, or they felt like no one would be interested, if they're empowered and say, hey, I really care about this, I want to do it. And then they can invite, or they could find communities of interest of other people who also care about that, who may not be within their team. And that brings more voices into the process. And that's, I think, the co-creation of culture. It's not just what reflects the majority, it's also what reflects the person in the back who maybe felt like they couldn't like speak up before.
So the question almost is for you to reflect on, what is the policy intervention that would empower the person in the back of the room to shape culture? Right? Not the firebrand, not the tip of the spear, the other guy. Think about it, but see what that leads you to. Probably it's an inquiry processing. I wonder what will happen. I don't think it'll be like an immediate thing. Let's try the third one. Let's try interests. Okay. So what's the big bet for interest? And hopefully, none of this is right or wrong. It's just reflective material saying, if I kind of start to strip this down, what's the essence of the thing that I'm doing?
Right. Yeah. Interest for me, I think it's one of the main places where communities formed. And I also think that interest can break down barriers that may exist. So I look at interest as like, let's say, for instance, you love to work at Chicago Tech. That was something where, out of a room full of people, was something that brought you and I together, right? Whereas before, maybe we wouldn't have had that because we didn't know that we had that interest in alignment.
Right.
So that's how I look at interest. I look at interest as a place to create more inclusive and cohesive cultures. Break down barriers, break down silos, I think interest, that common ground, I think it breaks down a lot of things.
Interesting. It almost feels like the word is too broad for the intent you have in mind. Almost, because it could mean so many things, from the books that you read to the places that you love. It has a certain intensity. that's not casual,
Hmm.
right?
No, I see exactly what you're saying, but I
Yeah.
don't know what's another word that can
Yeah.
be put on that.
It has commitment, it has focus, and it has passion. So it has all these three. There's nothing casual about it.
Yeah.
So, and that has a different quality. Same thing as 20% projects. It's something that you really believe in or feel for, right? So the reflection is, what's a good word for commitment plus focus plus passion? You may have to invent a word.
Tribe, maybe it's um yeah, I don't know. Tribe is the next thing that gives me the closest feeling to it, but
Tribe, true. That's there. Um, the value of a new word is when it's useful, people get it, and it creates separation in their head from everything else you're doing. So there's
right.
conceptual clarity when you say, "Oh, what do you mean?" And the explanation is simple. I'm saying, "We get it. We know the
Mm.
roots of this word, but it's completely new." And they reference that; it becomes a parameter by itself. So one example was the first time I ever was exposed to the process. We were trying to redesign the shoe, as a toy project. And he said, consider a new value parameter. Shoes always sold the same way. Why can't you sell it in different parameters? So we said, instead of size, we'll use foot pressure. And the
Foot
idea,
pressure.
here's, we made this shit up, but here's the idea.
Mhm.
It's not how well it cloaks your foot that's the key thing. It's the fact that everybody has a different walk, and their foot lands differently. So therefore, the shoe sizes are not what you're really interested in. What you're interested in for your peculiar walk, maybe you walk on the edge of your foot, maybe you put, pressure on your front carpals. You want it to be exactly for that kind of. So you said,
Yeah.
okay, if we can get that foot imprint, then we will actually sculpt the insoles for you. And we made the crap up, like I said, but it would have worked because they're like, it's like a glove.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Precisely what you want. So that's the idea. So I feel it's more than interest. Um, we'll see what this is. Colloquially in the Bay Area, it's always called the side hustle, which has a
The
certain
side hustle.
right.
Eh. Yeah, that's like why we named our company 5 to 9, because it was supposed to be like what inspired you the most. Like, who are you outside of work, right?
Mm,
And that's what we want to bring in
mm,
life integration and bringing your whole self to work. So that's why like interest in the 5 to 9 and all that is so big to us, because we're trying to kind of break the status quo of like what the 9 to 5 is and what it means. Um,
mm. So maybe that's typically when we talk about interest, we talk about um, it's overused and it's underdefined, but we talk of commonality.
yeah, commonalities.
Which is interesting. I mean, we speak because of commonality, and then like, ooh,
Yeah.
but it's not so much the commonality that's the key thing. Yes, Chai Tech in Chicago, but the assumption is there is depth behind that. What else do you like about Chicago, and what else are you doing in Chicago, Rana? And how deep did you go with Lance and Friends? Um, and that's what's really behind the commonality. So
That's
think
deep.
about
That's deep right there.
holy shit. That's
That's
as deep
deep.
as it gotta get. Okay. But if you process it, you can see that's why we are speaking again. That hey, there
Right.
was something in the first interaction. Maybe there's more. Who knows? I wonder where it'll go. And all that based on one word, right? So it's like a
Right.
network graph that you're trying to unpack and saying, what else, what else, what else, what else? And maybe that's what's happening. But think about what you want to call this.
Wow.
I think that's a good trigger. You want the effect to be, we think most passionate employees have X. Right now, we call it interests, but it should be side hustles or something else, right? And we want to find these people who already are kind of pointed towards something. where they're putting time, interest, any which was outside of work, but they're bringing it in. Because when you bring these side hustles into your work, you get passion and purpose and things like that. And it doesn't come from work, it gets included in work, right? Um, and around that, you can form things. So where does the interest come from? It's definitely outside of work. Because
And it's
likely what
true.
you're doing at work is a release from the stresses of work. Right? So think about that. There's something underground in the nature of what you're talking about. So let's think of a couple of analogies. Again, I think this is one of those things that it's in the right direction.
Right.
But because you're suffering under the fact that it's got a language that's overused.
Yeah.
So you have to spend some time deconfusing people by explaining what you mean by interest. Right? So it will help to have that clarified thing. Here's what we mean. It's the side hustle or whatever. So one analogy is like an underground band, right? They're doing this all the time. They're playing the shitty bars, the crappy deals in an effort to express themselves. At some point, they become mainstream. That could be one way of thinking about it, but there could be others. But if that's done, let's call it for now. What word would you want to use?
We can say side hustle.
Okay, for now. What's the bet? So we know the insight is, it's not a bet yet, right? The insight is side hustle is the places where communities form. Because people are already expressing passion in the same direction. Side hustle is a place to create more inclusive and cohesive cultures. That's true, that's an effect. What's the bet? If you do what, it will lead to cohesion.
If you encourage employees to participate in their side hustles, and you encourage them to invite others to participate in those, and it's seen as a good thing, the bet is that you will have more connected employees who not only feel more connected to the people they work with, but also to the company that they're at for letting them do that and encouraging it. And I feel like they'll be happier because their company cares about who they are, not only while they're there, but also while they're not there. And now that you're letting me bring that into this place, you're saying that this is a part of our culture too.
Resulting in workplaces where culture is introduced from the this is interesting. Integrated from the outside and not dictated top down. So it sounds like if you encourage employees to participate in the side hustles and invite others to participate, then you have more connected employees who are happier. That makes sense because I was always doing this. That's the reason Google has, a tech shop or like a carpentry shop, like rows and rows of machines. And there's only one place in the Bay Area that actually has that kind of tech shop. So like, wow, I can continue tinkering and stuff. But the interesting thing is that the workplace culture then has something of the outside. It seems one of the obvious side effects. Culture is something that's more not as homogeneous, it's more granular, but it is an infusion of stuff, like people bringing in passions and colors from outside rather than we are a robot army that behaves in a certain way.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I think that is like a key point right there, is I think that sometimes companies, they create like, this is who we are. And then other people come into it as they grow and as they scale. And
Mm.
then they're like, but this is who we are. Can
Mm.
this be a part
Yeah.
of the behemoth of what you
Mm.
stated as our values?
Mm.
And I think for the longest, it was like a no. It was like, this is who we are.
Mm.
And now they're saying that they have to figure out how can you bring in those elements
Mm.
to say that culture is something that can evolve over time,
Mm.
and that's not a bad thing. Like, you always keep your core of who you are, but you're not afraid to add in elements to what that looks like.
So it seems kind of a new parameter you're thinking about is that of an integrative culture, which means we have a core set of values and behaviors that really define us. And most high quality cultures have that. Netflix has that, Google has that, Apple has that. That there's a consistent set of behaviors that marks out these culture, you know, these people as part of this culture, but it's integrative. They benefit by having the diversity of passions and diversity of interests. Everybody has a second job that they're really good at, second passion that they're world class at, and that is what's brought to bear. So it's almost an example for how do you bring your real self to work, and in the process, it's not that one color overrides the other, the colors blend and a new color
Yeah.
emerges.
Yeah.
Around a core which is always consistent, core is maybe always white, but then, as you mix in colors, you get just new combinations. That's plenty for a conversation, don't you think?
Yeah, we've got some good stuff here. A lot of things to think about. Yeah, because I feel like when I talk about what we do, at least when I'm selling into organizations, what they want to hear about is the retention, the ROI. Like, they want to talk about the numbers. And what I really want to talk about is the why, the story, the reason why it matters. I think it matters so much. So I
Mm.
always feel like this internal battle with myself to have to sell it the way that where an org will buy it and they can get the buy-in for it, versus like me really trying to talk about the issue and the problem that exists, and why I think it's so important that employees are brought more so into the process versus just kind of seen as, hey, participate in it if you want, or don't participate in it if you don't like it, right?
So what I'd have you do is go to the system, so the experiment design part of the deck. We'll have got
Yep.
it there now.
Okay.
And then
All
see
right.
if you can write out your core bets that you're placing, right? You have one primary bet.
Yeah.
You have a couple of sub bets as well.
Mm-hmm.
And write it out and see if the language crystallizes over time, because that will inform a bunch of things. That will inform partly the forms you're creating, because what's the story you're going to tell. It'll inform the system design, how's this going to work, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the first place. Keep it around for a week and saying, I think our bets have stabilized. Because you can see, even as you look at it, the language changes, because you're for the first time seeing the language you've been using at a gut level,
Yeah.
But now
Yeah.
that you can reflect and saying, we
Yeah.
should be using this language. This language is old. This language needs to be new.
Yeah.
Socialize it. These are the bets. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Because it's one page long. Do you think this is what we're out to do with your co-founder? If that stabilizes, then all of these are like rabbit holes. You can go deep into them. Right? And each rabbit hole eventually gets embodied. For experiment, you will embody it. You will run a couple of tests.
Yeah.
You will change some parts of the system. Let's talk soon.
Yeah, please do. This was super helpful, and like, I'm just really excited to take it and to do more with it. So I really
Perfect.
appreciate you, taking the time with me.
Perfect. I guess a good way to do it is by pull. So once you feel you've got to the point that you've done the bets, and you want to check in, just call for it.
Okay.
We'll do one of these 45-minute things and see where that goes. How that sound?
Oh, yeah, sounds perfect. Thank you so much,
Okay.
Rana. I
My
appreciate
pleasure.
you. Like, really, it's always good to see you again. And if you're coming back to Chicago, let me
I
know.
will look you up. Absolutely. And you're coming, if you're in the Bay Area, the same goes for you as well.
Oh, yeah, I'll definitely be back for sure.
Yeah. Take care. Till we meet again
Okay, see
then.
you, Rana. Yeah,
Bye.
until we meet
Bye.
again. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.